Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Thanks for having me back. So we're going to continue. I mean, this is a huge topic, obviously. We could say far more about it. We might need to say more about it if there are questions. I did get a few questions forwarded to me. I think most of them we will address during this session. If we don't, you can let me know. I'll try to reply personally as well to the people that have asked me the question. I may allude as we go through here to some of those questions. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll just kind of bring up the issues that they bring up, because if they're thinking about it, maybe somebody else is thinking about it. At one point, in one question that I got, somebody asked me a question about Fair Mormon. I mean, I'm part of Fair Mormon. I don't represent them. I can't speak for them, but I can tell you about my experience with them or what we've done. The question asked, I'll quote it, quote, "Why does Fair Mormon go to such great lengths to silence any view that doesn't align with theirs?" Close quote. I don't know that we do that. I'm not sure how we would go about silencing anything that even if we if we wanted to, which we don't. That's pretty much impossible in today's world anyway. Also asked why we label anybody who doesn't agree with us anti-Mormon. We don't, to my knowledge, do that. That is certainly not our policy. We're a volunteer organization, so I can't say that someone somewhere hasn't done that. Just to be sure, I went and checked on the FAIR website under anti-Mormon, and we actually have a statement about this. Let me see. Fair Mormon does not believe or argue that everyone who disagrees with the LDS Church is anti-Mormon. I don't know how it can be more blunt than that. So certainly if we don't believe everyone who disagrees with the Church is anti-Mormon, then we certainly don't think anyone who disagrees with us is anti-Mormon. And the policy at Fair Mormon has always been, which will probably be rebranded actually. I think we're going back to Fair, last I heard, in accordance with President Nelson's encouragement about the label Mormon. In any case, I think one thing that we've found over the years is that with many questions, there's more than one possible answer, and it's never been useful, I don't think, to say this is the one and only true answer to a certain question, by and large. And so our policy, or our attempt in any case, is to try to be as broad as we can, and we'll often present more than one option as possible answers to a given question. So I apologize for not being able to answer that question perhaps the way the questioner wanted me to. It's a little bit of like, when did you stop beating your wife? Well, I've never stopped beating my wife because I've never been beating it as far as I know. But if that's happened, if we have done that, then I hope you'll send me an example so that we can fix it if that has happened. All right, so starting here, here's the church website. There's the link, and then you'll go here. It's the same place as before. Gospel topics. There's a bunch of them there. You scroll down and you click the plural marriage one, and then we're still here on kind of scrolling way down to the bottom, the beginnings of plural marriage in the church. One person who sent me a question said that they weren't particularly interested in the nitpicky things of what went on in Nauvoo, and that's fine. You don't have to be interested in small nitpicky things, as people might say, but unfortunately that's what history is. It's kind of like saying, well, I want to do this jigsaw puzzle, but I don't want to be bothered with all those nitpicky little pieces. Well, sorry, that's what jigsaw puzzles are. You have to deal with the small things. You can't get the bigger perspective until you've looked at the small. You kind of need both. You can't leave one to a side and do the other. So that's what we'll try to do here. These are questions we asked before. Did Joseph force women to marry him? No, he didn't. We talked about that. Did he marry women who were already married? Yes, he did, as we talked in excruciating detail last time. A lot of nitpicky stuff there. As far as we can tell, those marriages seem to have been intended to bind families together. And that continued to some degree even into the Brigham Young era. For example, Brigham Young was sealed to some of the women who had been sealed to Joseph, and he saw that as part of a duty he owed to Joseph. Heber C. Kimball did something the same. Heber C. Kimball asked one plural wife at the deathbed if she would tell Joseph that he had been faithful to that charge. So again, there's these ideas of kind of binding families together or groups together or people together. It might be asked, why wasn't the Lord more clear about how this was all supposed to work? Well, answering why God does or doesn't do anything is always a tricky proposition. I'm not God. In my experience, though, both as a member of the church and having been a bishop, the Lord will usually tell you what you should accomplish. He rarely will tell you how to get there or how you're supposed to do that. He will tell you should build a temple in spot X. He generally, though, will not tell you how to do all the foundation and, all the surveying and all that. He kind of leaves that to us. I think a good example to answer that sort of question would be the brother of Jared, a story you all know well, when he's building the boats and he comes to the Lord with a problem. Sometimes the Lord will just solve your problem. He comes to him about the problem of air, and the Lord just gives him the solution and says, look, this is what you're supposed to do about it. But then there was the question of the light, and the Lord did not give him a solution there. The Lord, helped him see what the end goal was, and he kind of stopped him from going down a few blind alleys. He said, fire's a really bad idea in these boats, so don't even think about that. Don't build windows, because it'll make the boats weak, and it's gonna break. But he left it kind of up to the brother of Jared. And certainly as a bishop, I found that happened. We would very often know where we needed to end up or what we wanted to accomplish or what we felt the Lord wanted us to do. But he really left it to us, by and large, to figure out how to get there. There are other examples of that in church history. For example, with the temple endowment. The initial temple endowment, as given by Joseph Smith before his death, took about 12 hours. Today, it happily doesn't take 12 hours, though I would dearly love to do that 12 hours with Joseph at least once and see what that looked like. And Joseph told the people that he did it to, he says, I don't have this quite right. It isn't quite how it needs to be, but I've done the best that I can under the circumstances we're in. And that was something that continued to evolve. The leaders of the church continued to work on that. Brigham Young ultimately assigned it to Wilford Woodruff to kind of standardize things and to accomplish the purpose they had, which was to administer certain ordinances and to provide certain teachings. But the Lord did not hand them a script and say, this is how this should go. And why might that be? Well, again, speculation, but the Lord's purpose on earth is not to turn us into good little robots who obey orders. We should obey him, but not just because in a clockwork sort of a way, right? He's trying to turn us into certain kinds of people who will trust him, people that will take the principles he teaches us and then be able to independently make wise decisions. One of the more interesting things you'll find in life is that very often the Lord will say, there's more than one way you can do this. There's more than one thing you can accomplish here. He really does, believe it or not, care about what we want and what we want to try. He lets us fail sometimes. He lets us learn things by trial and error. Just to pick a very silly maybe example, but maybe it'll hit home for all of you. All of you are well aware, I trust, that the Lord has told you that you should end up married at some point in your eternal existence. I don't know about you, but he certainly didn't give me a map to how to do that. I had to make all the embarrassing phone calls to girls. I had to get turned down. I had to look like it was not a pretty picture. It's kind of a miracle I made it to that end. But that's part of the process, right? I mean, he could have told me exactly how to get from A to B, and it probably would have been less painful. But it wouldn't have accomplished the purpose that it set out to accomplish. So I don't know if that applies in this case, but I suspect that it does, just because that's really a pattern that you see over and over and over again with the scriptures and in our lives. Someone asked and said, why is it that those of us who support the church, you might say, are trying to downplay the sexuality of these relationships? We talked about how these relationships to women that were already married were not consummated. To that, I would say I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just tell you the best I can what the best data shows. Like we talked about, if I had given this talk to you in, say, 2008, I would have told you that those marriages were probably consummated and that Joseph almost certainly probably had a daughter as a result of that. We now know that's not true. So I don't really care about that. I'm just here to tell you what the best I can, what I think the evidence shows. People can differ about evidence. That happens all the time, right? I sell a stock because I think the price is going to go down, and somebody else buys the stock because they think it's going to go up. We're both sincere in what we believe. We're both using the most data we can. One of us is right, one is wrong, but that's kind of how life is. We very rarely all look at data the same way. So all I can say is I'm giving you what I'm giving you because I sincerely believe it's the truth after long immersion in it. But I might change my mind. I have before, and I hope I will again. So question 4. The point of all that, though, is to say that I hope you remember from last week that that's a really good example of how in history a small couple of, tiny or seemingly insignificant details, a different date on a document, a small change in something can completely upend how we understand a really significant part of this. Question 4. How old were Joseph's wives? Well, he had wives aged from age 14 to 50. People often get quite excited about this and say, he was married to a 14-year-old, he must be a pedophile. So I'm going to talk about this, not because I think that in that context, someone who was married to a 14-year-old would be a pedophile. That's clearly not the case. But just because, I hope to reassure people if you're sincerely worried about that, I don't think that's something you have to worry about. Part of the key to understanding this is that especially the thing that has always, throughout human history and in many cultures, the thing that usually dictates the age at which men get married is how soon they can support a wife and kids. In an era before birth control, if you were getting married, that virtually guaranteed children were going to come, and you were going to be responsible for them and for your wife's upkeep. And so one of the key issues was how old is a man before he can support a wife? And depending on that puts pressure on various ages of women, depending on what the marriage market, if you want to look at it in economic terms, looks like. That can push the age of female marriage down, because if more men are getting married, then there's more women who've been taken out of that dating pool, we might say. And so if you're a man and you still want to get married, you might go slightly younger or slightly older than you might otherwise be inclined to. So in that spirit, Craig Foster, who's a historian and who works at the Family History Center, David Keller, who's a PhD student in physics modeling, and me, I was certainly the low man in this totem pole. But we got together and we said, well, let's look at that. Let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that Joseph Smith wasn't just one guy, but that he was, say, 30 guys, 30 people, all his age, and let's put those 30 people, those 30 imaginary people, into Joseph's situation, into the area and the time in which he lived, and let's see if those people stand out. Are those people weird? Because certainly Joseph having plural wives, that was weird. There's no question about that. But the question is, were the ages of his wives weird for him? If he was a 38, kind of 34 to 38, that was kind of the age he was during the most part of his marriages. If he was a 35-year-old man, just some farmer on the frontier, would it have been weird if he married a 50-year-old? Or would it have been weird if he married a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old or whatever? So that's what we set out to do. We said, let's look at that and see, is this is this as weird as some people think it is? Or given that we knew a fair amount about history, Craig Foster, for example, he works in the family history library at Salt Lake, so he always says to me, he says, I can't tell you the number of people I've seen in and out of the church that has this kind of pattern of marriage. I mean, this is just not a weird thing at that time and place, even though to us it's, it would be weird. So that's what we did here. So if you look, you can see these are ages of, sorry, President, I don't know what I did with the pen. Oh, there it is. Sorry, there we go. So here you see the various ages. If I can get the pen to work, we'll see how. Here we go. So here, there you go. So you can see the various ages, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And so this is the percentage of the wives that fall into that group. So here you have Joseph Smith right up at the top. And then you have various other places. You've got Nauvoo here, a Mormon area. Then there's Lee County, which is here, right here. So Lee County is right across the river from Nauvoo in Iowa. So it's exactly the same place, just a lot fewer LDS, though there were some. Then there's Northern Iowa, that's Louisiana here. Then there's Anyway, you get the idea. There's a variety of areas there that are looked at. And as you can probably see just by eyeballing this, Joseph really doesn't stand out. His percentages are really no different than the non-member or member monogamists who are living in his time and place. He, in fact, is only in the 86th percentile, so that's not statistically significant. If you left plural marriage aside, these marriages would have been normal in any of the 4 major areas of the U.S., the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, or the West, until the 1880s. So it just didn't stand out in that way. You'll have people say, oh, of course it did. Well, no, it didn't. I mean, if you've got better data, I'd be happy to see it. But, this isn't just one place. This is many places we compared it to, and it's just not. And so why would that be? Well, things tended to be, we talked about how young men needed to be able to support a wife. In the America at the time, that was basically farming. So it basically came down to how soon could you afford a farm. That determined how old you were when you got married and how common it was to be married. And so as you move west in the United States, land became cheaper and easier to get. And unsurprisingly, marriage ages dropped there. So if you lived way back in New England, out in New York and that kind of place where people had been settled for several generations, it was much harder. If you were out in Missouri or in Iowa or Illinois, where Joseph Smith was, it was not hard at all because land was, if not free, at least cheap. This here we compared to a variety of areas. This is the percentages of teen brides in a variety of things. You can see the percent here. So 30% of the people to whom Joseph was sealed were 19 or lower. All the way here. Here's in the West, 55%. Right? And again, so that's that trend, whereas New England, only 9%. So that's what you expect to see. Eastern-wise, it's harder to get married as early, and so people have older marriage rates. And then as you move west, you see that. That's a well-known phenomenon. Same kind of thing. This is people married in Kirtland. So that's monogamous Mormons married in Kirtland. Joseph is right here. Okay. And then the brown is people in the 1950 census in Illinois. And then I forget what the other one is. Oh, yeah, and then the other is Nauvoo. So, and again, hopefully you can eyeball that and say, yeah, that's just not statistically significant. If anything, Joseph was lower here, right? Lower than the people that surrounded him in that respect. This just shows what I was talking about with ages. The red is the men, and here's the teenage line right here. Okay, so this shows what percent of teenagers were married at this time and place. The men are way lower, right? They're way down here, and the women are higher, which is what you expect to see. So that was for the 1850 census. We didn't do sooner because that's the first census where they talked about about marriage and marital age. So it was the earliest place we could get data, but that's only 6 years after Joseph's death, so it's probably a reasonable facsimile. This is the youngest of Joseph's plural wives, Helen Mar Kimball. She was the daughter of Hebersy and Valadi Kimball. She was sealed at 14 years, 9 months. The sealing was, interestingly, her father's idea. Helen said later in life it was his idea because he desired to be connected to Joseph. So again, you see that idea of how this plural marriage sealing, part of the purpose was this linking of families. So it wasn't just linking in a vertical, marriage, kids, but it was across groups as well. Heber taught it to his daughter first, and then he had her meet with Joseph. She continued to live with her parents afterwards, and was quite surprised and a little put out that she wasn't still allowed to go to dances or date, which is probably a good suggestion that this was not a traditional consummated marriage. You'd expect that she would have connected the dots on that, but it was probably more of a ceremonial thing. Most historians don't believe that the marriage was consummated. And another interesting thing about that is we talked last time about the Temple Lot Church and the Temple Lot case, and about how the Temple Lot Church court case, they wanted to call women who had had sexual relations with Joseph in his plural marriages. And there were 3 of them that were alive that had been the polyandrous marriages, and none of them were called, probably because they weren't useful for that purpose. The same is true of Helen Mar Kimball. She was alive and well, and she was available for testimony. She was probably the most well-known LDS woman advocate of plural marriage. She had written books about it. So if anybody would have been happy and willing to testify about a consummated relationship, it would have been her, but she was not called. And so she probably, just was not useful in that way. That's not to say there weren't sexual relations with some of the other wives. Yes, there were. Of course there were. Question number 5. Did Joseph have any children from any plural wife? We talked about that quite a bit last time. Almost all of them have been ruled out by DNA testing. There's 1 or 2 left that are vague, somewhat possibilities, but they both died in infancy, or one died in infancy and the other one is presumed to have died in infancy if it existed. And so we're never going to have a final answer to that. That brings up an interesting question, and it's to say, well, part of the reason that this was done, at least if you read Jacob 2 in the Book of Mormon, it talks about raising up seed through plural marriage. And so the question becomes, well, why weren't there children if that was part of the purpose? We'll talk about that more later on tonight. And it's certainly one of the purposes. It doesn't seem to have been the only purpose. And the key to remember is that the purpose was less to have more children, in terms of number of kids. It was to create children that were raised up to the Lord, that would be faithful to him in a covenant. And certainly anybody who was living plural marriage and who watched their parents do that would have had no doubt in their minds about where their parents stood with relationship to the gospel. They would have seen people willing to sacrifice a great deal to follow the gospel and to do what they believed they'd been commanded to do by God. So that's part of it. But as we'll see, there's more to that. Question number 6, was Joseph promiscuous in his early years? Was he a quote-unquote womanizer? This was, interestingly, not a charge that was made at all during Joseph's lifetime. It wasn't only till decades later that people began claiming that, which should immediately make you suspicious. If it would have been very useful to make those claims when Joseph was alive, and the fact that they didn't is pretty good evidence they didn't have grounds to make them. None of them hold up to historical scrutiny. At the risk of shamelessly self-promoting, Brian Hales and I wrote a paper on this. Response to Grant Palmer's. I've made a easy little URL there if you want to find it. It's tinyurl.com/JSWomanizer. You can go there and read it. And we look at every example, and I think you'll find that they really don't hold water. Did men or women simply obey Joseph because he was the prophet? Definitely not. And in fact, people who make this argument, I really think in some ways it's a bit offensive to claim that these men, and especially these women, were just these blind, helpless, whatever you say. They very clearly were not. If you read their experiences and how they interacted with Joseph and with the idea. Interestingly, they reported many miraculous visions that confirmed to them that plural marriage was a command from God. I'll show you a few examples just because they're impressive. This is Zina Huntington. She's one of Joseph's polyandrous wives. She said, I searched the scripture, and by humble prayer to my heavenly Father, I obtained a testimony for myself that God required that order to be established in this church. I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved. But could I compromise conscience, lay aside the sure testimony of the Spirit of God for the glory of this world? Again, I think it's pretty offensive to say this is a woman who just blindly followed Joseph and did what he told her to. She was well aware of what was going on. She was well aware of the cost and was willing to pay it. Here's a less well-known one. I thought the anointed of the Lord, that's Joseph, would not get more wives unless they were commanded to do so. But still, I wanted a knowledge of the truth for myself. I asked my husband if he did not think we could get a revelation for ourselves on that subject. He said he did not know. So here you have a woman driving the show, right? This is not some, horrible patriarchal guy dominating her. She's the one pushing this. That evening, she says, my mind was carried away from the earth, and I had a view of the order of the celestial kingdom. I have seen so much wrong connected with this ordinance that had I not had it revealed to me from him that cannot lie, I should have doubted the truth of it. So that's really interesting, right? This is not someone with a rosy view of this process. This is not somebody who says, oh yeah, it was all great and sunshine and puppy dogs. No, it was incredibly difficult. People made major mistakes with this. She was... this is not someone blind to the problems, to the point that she said, if God himself hadn't shown it to me, I wouldn't believe it. But God did show it to her. She goes on, but there's never a doubt crossed my mind concerning the truth of it, since the Lord made it known to me by a heavenly vision. I was filled with love and joy that was unspeakable. I waked my husband and told him of the views I'd have, and that the ordinance was from the Lord, but it would damn thousands. It was too sacred for fools to handle, for they would use it to gratify their lustful desires. So again, not a rosy Pollyanna, oh, this is great. I mean, she had a very clear-eyed view of both the challenges and the problems. But despite that, could not deny what she'd been told. So I think it's hard to see Sarah Levitt as someone who's just full of wishful thinking or who gets a revelation because she wants it or she doesn't dare doubt. This is someone who very clearly saw the problems and yet got revelation about it. And I like this one. I like it partly because it's a couple, we don't even know their names. It was just something that was written down about it. So this is kind of your anonymous garden variety member of the church, just like you and me. This isn't Joseph or Brigham or Heber or, all the people that are kind of famous in history. This is just Joe Blow, Mormon couple in Nauvoo. I find that interesting too, we each began having revelations from heaven night after night, saying that we must go back to the customs of the patriarchs with regard to Mary. That's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were polygamists. The whole thing was so repugnant to us both that for some time we could not receive it. The revelations, however, became clearer and more emphatic, and at last my wife ventured to communicate to me what the Lord had declared to her. This led to a comparison of experiences all around, and we found the same revelation had come to many, and hence it was received and acted upon as the unmistakable will of heaven. So here you have a couple who hasn't even heard about plural marriage. They haven't been taught it. They don't know that it's going on. They start having these revelations. Both of them are appalled at the idea. Again, this is not wish fulfillment, wishful thinking. These are people who are appalled at it, but they keep having these revelations. Finally, the wife brings it up. I get that totally. You can bet I would not be raising this with my, the wife can bring that up. And so then, as he says, then we began comparing views all around. My wife and I actually had an experience like that. We were not like plural marriage, thank goodness, but there was this house that went up for sale, and we both looked at the house. We just had seen that it was up for sale. We both noticed. We never talked about it or anything, and we were both kind of feeling like we should buy this house. But it was kind of a big house, and we both knew we both hated moving. And so I was saying to my mom one day, I said to her, I kind of look at that house, but I don't want to go bother Jennifer with that. And my mom said, well, you two need to talk more, because she said the exact same thing to me last week. And we ended up buying the house. So yeah, I know what that's like, a little bit, I think. Was plural marriage illegal? Well, this is a really interesting question, and it explains one of the questions that I got asked. And one of that is, why did Joseph keep this so secret? And there are basically three answers to that question. And why did he sometimes deny that plural marriage was being practiced? Well, the first reason was that to admit it openly would have been to court disaster. It would have meant that the mob would have come down on them, and the militia, and there would have been death. That seems unmistakable. A lot of people don't realize this, but the last LDS people in Nauvoo were actually driven out by a militia with cannons and guns. Okay, and if it had been known they were doing this, it would have been game over. So he did it partly to keep innocent people from being killed. The second reason is there was a big problem in Nauvoo, and that's that an apostate member of the church had gone out and was spreading all sorts of rumors about basically wife swapping. They called it spiritual wifery. This was completely different from plural marriage, and it was a much more corrupt idea, a much more licentious idea. And so a lot of members of the church, including Joseph, spent a great deal of time rebutting those claims, saying we were not practicing that kind of thing. So it's very interesting. If you study the language that they use, they're very careful. They're very careful to say specific things that apply to the one that don't apply to plural marriage. The third reason was that adultery, which would have, if you were having sex with someone you weren't married to, that was adultery. Adultery was a crime under the civil law at the time. But interestingly, it was only a crime if you flaunted it openly. So if you were sneaking over to your lover's house or whatever, you weren't liable to prosecution under the law. If you did it publicly, though, if you said, yes, I'm married to this woman and I'm married to this woman, then you would have been liable. So that was the other reason, is that there were legal implications of that. Ultimately, the U.S. government declared plural marriage itself illegal in 1862 in the territories, when Utah wasn't Utah then, it was Deseret Territory. The Latter-day Saints continued to practice their faith because they believed that their allegiance to God was higher than civil law if the Lord commanded them. If President Wild wants me to, we'll talk about that part of plural marriage another time. That's a huge topic and the thing that first got me interested, actually. Question number 9, was it necessary to practice plural marriage to be saved? That, again, is a really interesting question, and it's one of the questions I got answered. Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff were both clear, very clear, in fact, that the Latter-day Saints needed to have faith in the command to practice plural marriage. But they made it clear that people would go to the celestial kingdom in plural marriages, in single marriages, and not married at all in this life. This was an intensely difficult commandment. However difficult you find it, however difficult it troubles you or me, it troubled them more. And so they went, I think, to great lengths to kind of talk it up, to encourage themselves, to encourage each other. And so sometimes you'll find Brigham or somebody saying, we have to do this. This is an eternal thing that's going to go on. But then at other times you have him saying, it's not going to be forever, or it's not necessary for everyone. And certainly the majority of members of the church did not enter into it. Probably only about 5% of men at the highest were in it. So if you're going to argue that the members of the church really believed that they all had to do it or they couldn't be saved in the celestial kingdom, that means 95% of the men were just going through the motions. I don't think that's plausible. So I think they had a more subtle or a more nuanced understanding. But they certainly believed, most of them, that it was going to go on that way forever. And that was said. They were surprised, and some of them were relieved when it turned out that it wasn't. Some of them even believed that Heavenly Father or Jesus were practitioners of plural marriage. It's not clear why they believed that, other than they really believed that this was a vital thing, and so they just sort of assumed it logically, right? If this is what it took to be saved, then of course God or Jesus would have to be involved. But there's no revelation to that effect, I don't think, and this church certainly doesn't teach it today. One of the difficult things, it can be difficult when we're trying to live a principle and we think about things broader. A good example, I think, would be the word of wisdom. That's something that's been established in our church in our day. It's part of our covenant stuff. Certainly we believe that if you don't keep the word of wisdom, there's going to be some problems in the judgment day. I won't presume to tell you what those are, but we see that as important. Because it is so important to us, because it is a commandment that we have been given, what you will sometimes find is that Latter-day Saints will, I think erroneously, will project those ideas into other points in time. One example of that I heard a lot growing up was that Jesus and the apostles didn't drink wine, that they drank grape juice. Well, I'm sorry, that's crazy. I mean, if you take grape juice in the Middle East with no refrigeration and stick it in a bottle, within 3 days you've got wine. You don't have grape juice. And so, and it's very clear that this was a commandment given to us for our day, for our time. And so it's not appropriate for us to say, oh, this is something that everybody everywhere has to do. I think the early members of the church made a similar sort of error, as they kind of said, well, we're being asked to do this and it's really, really important that we obey, and so therefore it must be something that's eternal or that's always there. But again, even the Book of Mormon makes it clear that that's not the case, and so that's how I understand that anyway. So yeah, there's no question that they thought it was going to go on longer and be more permanent than it turned out to be. But again, the Lord doesn't always show us the future. He rarely does. And usually he shows us what we need to do in the here and now. He shows us the next step. And it's usually us who extrapolate that beyond when we should. There's probably a lesson in that for our own lives. Here we go. We talked a little about this. What percent of the saints practice plural marriage? That's difficult to answer because it depends on the time, the city, the place, the period. But at average, it was probably 15 to 20%, probably about 5% of men at its height. So it was never the majority, but it had a really significant impact on Latter-day Saint culture and experience. An interesting way to look at it, which I really like, is to say that about 25% of women years were spent in plural marriage. So if you took all the women who were alive at that time, a quarter of those years added together would have been in a plural relationship. And 50% of children years were in that. So while it was a minority of people, it had a huge impact. And that's partly true because most of the people, or rather most leaders of the church, were required to be in plural marriage. So if you were a bishop or a stake president or an apostle or something like that, you were almost certainly practicing it. So kind of the more prominent or the more historically visible people tended to be in plural marriage. So it had a massive impact, there's no question. But it was always a minority practice that declined over time, typically. If you want to see those... So how many did they have? Most had only 2, a few had 3. We tend to see these pictures of these big, massive families. I'll show you a picture. That's Joseph F. Smith, the, 5th president of the church? No, 6th. 6th president of the church, with all his wives and children. That's very much the exception. This is the more typical thing. This is from a study in the 1950s, and then this is in the late 80s, I believe. No, sorry, 2001. And they came up with virtually identical things. 2/3 of plural marriages were 2 wives, another 1/5 were 3, and then it really dwindled down from there. Number 12, was divorce allowed for plural marriage? Yes, it was. Utah at the time had the most liberal divorce laws in the Union, which in some ways I think is pretty funny. People would come out to Utah to be able to get a quickie divorce from the United States, you know. So it was a far more liberal divorce area than most of the United States, or all of the United States at the time. About 1% of monogamous marriages ended in divorce. About 9% of plural marriages did. So, you know, it was 9 or 10 times as high. So it gives you some insight into how difficult it probably was. That said, I mean, if today we could have a 9% divorce rate, we'd be thrilled. Would that we could have such good numbers. It's interesting, though, it wasn't just about plural marriage. There are plenty of examples of women who got divorced and remarried in another plural marriage. So it wasn't like they said, forget this plural marriage thing. Some of them probably did, but certainly not all of them. Question 13, did Joseph send men on missions so he could marry their wives? No, that comes from John C. Bennett. He's the same guy who came up with the spiritual wifery idea that I mentioned to you. So he made this claim in print. Bennett's claims were so over the top that even most anti-Mormons of the time didn't really believe them. He named a bunch of people whose wives Joseph had supposedly stolen after he sent them on missions. Probably, I think, presuming that if he made it look authentic, people would buy it. And some did. But when it helps for historians, because when historians go back and look, we can see whether they were gone on missions when Joseph got married, was sealed to their wives, and they were not. There was a single example of that. All the others were not. So this is Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde. Orson Pratt left, you remember, on a mission to... Hyde, not Pratt. She was sealed to Joseph on one of two dates, either April 1842 or after Orson was back, May 1843. So she may not even have been sealed while her husband was gone, but if she was, the date was 1842. Now I ask you, if you're the crafty, sex-crazed Joseph Smith and you want to get rid of this guy so you can be sealed to his wife, why do you send him in 1840 and not pull this until 1842? That's a pretty long burn of your evil scheme. He came back and approved the sealing to Joseph. Question 14. Why was plural marriage put in place? So we've alluded to this. We don't know the answer. We know that Joseph told people that God had told him that the church couldn't progress without it. He doesn't seem, or at least we have no record of him telling us any more than that. So again, it's one of these phenomena that we see over and over where the Heavenly Father will tell you need to do something, or he'll give you a commandment. He won't give you a road and he won't give you an explanation. He just tells you what needs to happen and leaves it to you to do it. Elder Oakes talked about this. He said, it's not the pattern of the Lord to give reasons. We can put reasons to commandments, and when we do, we're on our own. Let's not make the mistake that's been made in the past, trying to put reasons to revelations. The reasons turn out to be man-made to a great extent. The revelations are what we sustain as the will of the Lord, and that's where safety lies. Close quote. So having said that, I'm now going to break the rule and I'm going to give you my ideas. These are just my ideas. These are not revelation. But they're certainly things that plural marriage accomplished or made happen or made easier to happen. Whether they're the reason or reasons, I don't know. But they're at least worth thinking about because it did do some very unique things for the church that I think were pretty important and do kind of reinforce this idea of what Joseph said, that the church couldn't progress without it. I'm going to show you some examples of why. One of the ways that I don't think can be overestimated, so here on the left there's an anti-Mormon cartoon. This was published at the death of Brigham Young, which was a chance for the cartoonists in America to just go nuts. So this is one of Brigham's wives who divorced him, apostatized from the church, and went on an anti-Mormon lecture tour and wrote anti-Mormon books. So here she's being led into heaven, and then here you have evil old Brigham down here burning in hell. but it illustrates something that's important in the sociology of religion. If you think about it, and I think we've talked about this before, establishing a new religion is a pretty tricky thing. It's not something that happens all the time. In fact, establishing a new world religion, like the Church of Jesus Christ, you could probably count on both hands the number of times that's happened. It's a unique thing. For a new religion to succeed, you need what they call moderate tension with the society around them. There's three options. There's light tension, there's heavy tension, and there's Goldilocks tension, just right, medium. If you have light tension, it's very hard for this small group of new religious people to form a cohesive whole. It's hard to become a new culture. What tends to happen is you just tend to kind of get blurred out into the background of your society. If you want to see a good example of that, look at the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this was a break-off group that after plural marriage was announced and Brigham Young and most of the saints went west, some stayed back in Illinois in that area. And they reformed the church, but without temple work and without things like plural marriage. They insisted plural marriage was Brigham's idea, not Joseph's. And, well, what happened to them? Well, they quickly became virtually indistinguishable from conservative or moderate Protestants. There just wasn't enough that made them different, that set them apart. And so they just kind of blurred in. And nowadays they still exist. They're called the Community of Christ, but they don't believe the Book of Mormon is scripture or an ancient record. So they've just kind of homogenized, you might say. The other option isn't so good either. That's high tension. Well, high tension means that it's so high that the society tries to wipe you out. You can see what high tension looked like for the Mormons in the early parts of the church's history. They were driven out of one place for another. There was extermination orders. And so that kind of tension isn't good either, because if you kill everybody who's a part of the religion tends not to flourish. So polygamy, plural marriage, did something that was right in the middle. The saints had distance, which helped, because if they hadn't had distance, they would have been in big trouble. But they had distance, and it made them different and weird enough, if you will, strange enough, set apart from American society, that they became their own culture. They became a firm, rooted group with their own ideas. And then once things like the railroad and more expansion of the United States into Utah came, that had been established. And they were a functional group. There were enough of them with a firm culture that they could kind of withstand the effects of society around them. So you might think about what that in our church today, what are the things that set us apart? If you're wanting to fit in and to blend into the world, you're in the wrong faith. That's not how this works. You're going to be different. You're going to be weird. You're going to be unique. You're going to stand out. That's the point. If you don't, then chances are you're going to homogenize out, and you'll be just like everybody else, and thus not nearly as useful to the Lord as you could be. Number two, I talked about this too. Children were born into such families, including some of my own family, so I have a kind of a personal vested interest in this one, could see the members of the church being dedicated and great sacrifice. Again, if you want to develop a culture, a group of people who will be faithful to the church and the gospel and their covenants, that's a really good way to do it. And the descendants of plural marriage families really dominated the leadership of the church up to the present day. If you look at the number of people in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and higher leadership, even in our area like Southern Alberta or Utah. Southern or Northern Alberta, there's a lot of descendants of plural families there. It created kind of a generational fidelity to the church. Number three, there's some women today who might sympathize with this. If you look at the statistics, the women worthy of temple recommends in Utah always outnumbered the worthy men. So even if every temple-worthy man in Utah had gotten married monogamously, there would have been women left over. And so those women would have had one of two choices. They could either remain single their whole lives, which would basically be a ticket to poverty in that time and place, or plus they wouldn't have the joys of a husband and of family and all those things. Or they could have married men who were not faithful to the church or were not even members of the church. There were plenty of miners and prospectors and U.S. military personnel out in Utah at the time, but They were obviously not part of the church. So what polygamy allowed, and this is a problem with modern day polygamy and some of the break-off, the fundamentalist churches, that they didn't have. In the fundamentalist churches, it's a closed group. And so if men marry polygamously, then that leaves men unmatched, young men who can't get married. Those are called the lost boys. But that wasn't a problem in Utah because they had this continuous stream of immigrants, of people who were joining the church from the East or from Europe especially, and were immigrating. And more women than men were part of that immigration group. And so this was important because a lot of those women, one of my family members is among them, for example. My great whatever grandmother Litchfield had 7 boys, and she was married to an English sea captain, and she joined the church. And he basically said, "It's your church or me," and she said, "Well, I pick my faith." And so he threw her out into the street in winter with her and her 7 kids. She immigrated to Utah. Now, how desirable do you think a woman with 7 children is in the marriage market, all else being equal? Not very. How financially secure do you think that woman and her 7 children were? Not very. And so plural marriage allowed these groups access to resources. Immigrant women was important. Again, if you're an immigrant from a country that doesn't speak English, for example, and there were many of those, a lot of people came from Scandinavia and Germany to the valley. Again, if you're a man marrying one and only one wife, if there's lots of women, immigrant women are probably going to rank lower on your list of choices. But if women are married more easily because you have men marrying more than one, then again, in an economic sense, that makes women a valuable resource, and that makes men willing to consider marrying people they might not have otherwise married. So they've studied this, and it's quite interesting. The effect of plural marriage was to take money from the richest parts of society and to distribute it downward into the more poor parts of society. So it was one way of accomplishing that. It also allowed for education and careers of women. Brigham Young called 3 women. They were the first people he called after the Civil War. He sent them back east to become doctors. They were some of the first scientifically trained doctors in Utah. And in the absence of having other women to help share the burden of children and stuff, that just wasn't a feasible thing. Running a household was a full-time job and then some because, we obviously didn't have electricity or anything like that. So it really opened up opportunities for women in an ironic way. Utah was the second area in the United States to give the vote to women. Again, one of those funny stories. People in the East said, "Oh, these poor Mormon women, they're so oppressed and everything, it's just terrible. And if they could speak for themselves, then they'd vote polygamy out." And so the people in Utah said, "Okay, fine, we'll give women the vote." And gave women the vote, and the women kept on trucking. So the Americans eventually took the vote away from them, as it turned out. So much for, liberation. They did another thing, too, where they set up it was kind of like a halfway house, basically, where they would run these halfway houses that were designed to be shelters for women fleeing polygamy. That if you wanted to get away from polygamy and you couldn't afford it, or, you were worried that they'd find someone, they had to shut them down for lack of interest. Nobody went. If you want to learn more about this guy and his wife, he's the best living expert on this. He's got a website, josephsmithspolygamy.org, and then mormonpolygamydocuments.org. The last one is really great because he's basically scanned and put every document about Joseph Smith era plural marriage on the website, which is extraordinary. I mean, I wish I'd had this 20 years ago. He wrote 3 books on it here. So if you're interested in every question, issue, it's very fair-minded. He shows you all the data, he gives you all the options, and then he tells you what he thinks and why he thinks it. But, if you want to make up your own mind and look at the data, these are the books to read. They're wonderful. He and his wife also wrote this one. This is a single volume, and it's basically just the facts, ma'am. It's a boiled down version. So if you just want to know what he thinks or what his conclusions are, you read that one. If you want to kind of do the work yourself and see all the data, then you read the other ones. So Brian Hales, Hales. They're available on Kindle and stuff too. Question 17. I think this in many ways is perhaps the biggest question people have. Do we or will we in the future, either in this life or in the celestial kingdom, need to practice plural marriage? And the answer to that seems to be a clear-cut no. What it's necessary to do is to do what the early saints did, and that is to obey the word of the Lord given through a modern-day prophet to us. This is from the seminary manual, who tells teachers, avoid sensationalism and speculation when talking about plural marriage. Sometimes teachers speculate that plural marriage will be a requirement for all who enter the celestial kingdom. And we saw why that speculation arose, I think, to a degree. We have no knowledge that plural marriage will be a requirement for exaltation. This is Dallin H. Oakes. Most of you probably know Brother Oakes, Elder Oakes, President Oakes now. His first wife, June, died, and he's remarried. So he's sealed to two women. He's sealed to June, and then he's sealed to Kristen, his current wife. And so that puts him in an interesting situation, I think, right? That puts him as someone who's sealed to two women. We presume that both he and them were faithful. So how does that look? What does that look like in the eternal worlds? Does that mean he's a polygamist forever, and they're in this polygamous relationship? And this is what he says. I think he gets a lot of mail about this, because this is something we worry about. We can all wonder privately about circumstances in the spirit world, or even discuss these and others' unanswered questions in family or other intimate settings. But let us not teach or use as official doctrine what does not meet the standards of official doctrine. To do so does not further the work of the Lord, and may even discourage individuals from seeking their own comfort or edification through the personal revelation of the Lord's plan provides for each of us. Excessive reliance on personal teachings or speculations may even draw us aside from concentrating on learning efforts that will further our understanding and help us go forward on the covenant path. From letters I have received, I know that others are troubled by questions about the spirit world we will inhabit after we die and before we are resurrected. Some assume the spirit world will continue many of the temporal circumstances and issues we experience in this mortal life. What do we really know about conditions in the spirit world? I believe a BYU religion professor's article on this subject had it right. When we ask ourselves what we know about the spirit world from the standard works, the answer is not as much as we often think. And I would add that if that's true of the spirit world, then what we know about the celestial kingdom is even less. There's very little about the celestial kingdom, what it's like. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the scriptures say, eye hath not seen, and ear hath not heard, neither has entered into the heart of man what God has prepared for them that love him. You literally cannot conceive of how good the celestial kingdom is. However good you think it is, you're wrong. It's better. You cannot conceptualize it. You can't get your head around it. So most of what we know about post-mortal life is really more spirit world stuff, and we really don't get much of a glimpse of what the celestial kingdom is like. You remember some of those quotations we read from those women who talked about having that vision open to them, and that's what made them feel better about plural marriage, is that they realized whatever they saw, whatever they perceived, was enough to say to them, okay, it's all right, I don't need to worry. Trust in the Lord, Elder Oakes continues, is a familiar and true teaching in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That was Joseph Smith's teaching when the early saints experienced severe persecutions and seemingly insurmountable obstacles, including plural marriage, I would add. That is still the best principle we can use when our efforts to learn, our attempts to find comfort, encounter obstacles in matters not yet revealed or not yet adopted as the official doctrine of the Church. The same principle applies to unanswered questions about sealing in the next life or desired readjustments because of events or transgressions in mortality. There is so much we do not know that our only sure reliance is to trust the Lord and his love for his children. I think this is maybe, in some ways, anything that's powerful, anything that's useful has a downside, right? I mean, fire can keep you warm and cook your food and forge your iron, but it can also burn you and burn down your house, right? So fire, it's good and bad. It can be used in both ways. That's true even of a doctrine like eternal families. Eternal families is an incredibly powerful, important, comforting doctrine, right? When someone you love dies, You know you can see them again. You don't have to worry about being separated from your child who dies in childbirth, or your parents, or your wife, or your husband. I mean, those are wonderful blessings. The downside to that doctrine is that if we feel things aren't good in our families, that can make the pain worse. If we say, well, I can't stand being around this person now for 5 minutes, much less eternity, right? That can be painful. If we're not yet married, or it doesn't look like we're going to be married, or if we have same-sex attraction, and so we don't believe that, a marriage in this life is in the cards, that can be incredibly painful because of the power of this doctrine. And so you must always couple that doctrine and any other with this thing that Elder Oakes is talking about, this trust in the Lord. That's the fundamental doctrine. The first principle of the gospel is faith. And faith does not mean, I believe something even though I don't have perfect evidence. Faith means I trust because I do not always have perfect evidence. Faith is not just a mental belief in something. Faith is a deep trust in someone because of who and what they are. We have faith. We don't just have faith. We have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, right? All the other faiths will let you down, but trusting him will never let you down. So sometimes people will say, do I have to believe that plural marriage was from God? Can I believe that this was just all a terrible mistake? Well, you can't force what you believe, right? You could hold a gun to my head or to my kid's head and say, you need to believe X. And I might tell you I believe X, but you can't change whether I truly believe it or not. You can't force yourself to believe anything or to disbelieve anything that you believe. You believe what you believe. I will say this, though. You should be careful because it is an unstable belief in a way. Let me just point out the things that you need to take account of if you're going to say that. If you're going to say that Joseph Smith made a mistake with plural marriage, then you also have to admit that he either made a mistake or he lied when he said that an angel came to him 3 times and told him to practice it. Well, if Joseph can make a mistake or lie about an angel telling him to practice plural marriage, why should I believe him that he saw an angel that gave him the Aaronic priesthood, or the Melchizedek priesthood, or the temple endowment, or any of the other things that he was told, right? That's a very slippery slope. Maybe you have a way to settle that, and if you do, God bless you. But be careful. Joseph Smith used to say, when you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other. So you have to also be able to explain why all these people that we saw got revelations about it and told it. You have to discard Doctrine and Covenants 132, which is, that's canonized scripture that has plural marriage in it. It's also got eternal families in it, so are you willing to chuck that out? So can you be a faithful, practicing member of the church and not believe this? Of course you can. I'm sure you can. What matters really is not so much what you believe, it's what your beliefs lead you to do. If you are able to believe that and yet still trust the Lord with all your heart, still have total confidence that the church is directed today, as it always has been, by prophets, seers, and revelators, that the priesthood of God persists here and that we are the only ones with the ordinances that will save us and the whole human family, if you can do that, then go ahead. But in my experience, people who start down that road don't end up in a good place. If the church is not true, if the church is not what it claims to be, you should do something better with your time. Life is too short to waste your time on something that is not true. If the church is not what it says it is, then you should find something else that's true or enjoy the brief moments of happiness and pleasure that you will get until you dissolve into dirt and are food for worms, right? I've always said, if I ever lose my faith in the church, please don't let me be one of those anti-Mormons on Reddit complaining about the church for hours on end. Please let me be on a beach somewhere, right? Like, life is too short. It's too short. So if this troubles you, and there are many people that it troubles, and it should, you could say, if you really understand it, then get your answers. But I would caution you, sometimes it's easier, or it feels easier to just say, well, I'm just going to reject that, and then I don't have to worry about it. Well, that, like all decisions, has a cost, and people don't always count the cost. And we should, I think, always want to know what's true, whether it's comfortable or not. That's why I said I really don't care if Joseph's marriages were consummated or not. I just care about what the facts tell me. If they were one way, great. If they were the other, great. I just want to know. Every little error you adopt into your thinking will pervert or will change or will impair your ability to find truth in other areas. We want to be as pure as we can, I think. So how do you do that with this or with anything regarding family in this? President Eyring has a really good quote. He says, "A prophet of God once offered me counsel that gave me peace. I was worried that the choices of others might make it impossible for our family to be together forever." Right? There's that double-edged sword, right? Eternal family is great. If my grandkid is screwing up and has left the church, well, that breaks my heart because that means I won't be with him forever, right? You can't have one without the other. The prophet said to President Eyring, "You are worrying about the wrong problem. You just live worthy of the celestial kingdom, and the family arrangements will be more wonderful than you can imagine." Right? That goes back to what I was saying. However good you think it is, you're wrong. You're completely wrong. It's way better than that. To all those whose personal experience or whose marriage and children or absence thereof, and I would add, and the church's messy, difficult history of plural marriage, cast a shadow over their hopes, I offer my witness. Heavenly Father knows and loves you as his spirit child. While you were with him and his beloved Son before this life, they placed in your heart the hope that you have of eternal life. With the power of the atonement of Jesus Christ working and with the Holy Spirit guiding, you can feel now and will feel in the world to come the family love your Father and his beloved Son want so much for you to receive. I testify that as you live worthy of the celestial kingdom, the prophetic promise that family arrangements will be more wonderful than you can imagine will be yours. And I would say the same thing. Again, if whatever belief you come to on plural marriage makes you able to live worthy of the celestial kingdom, great. If it does not, I would urge and invite you to reconsider what you have decided. President Oakes again. This is for an interview done on PBS. The interviewer says, "There's some confusion that polygamy is definitively and unequivocally disallowed in this world. What happens in the next? There's a perception that polygamy is part of the afterlife. Could you talk about that?" Dallin H. Oakes said, "If I talked about that, I'd be making doctrinal statements where the prophet has not chosen to make doctrinal statements, so I think I shouldn't say anything except to affirm that a lot of people, myself included, are in multiple marriage situations. Look at the significance of that. There are a lot of people that live on this earth that have been married to more than one person. Sometimes those marriages have ended with death, sometimes they've ended with divorce. What does the next life mean to them in relation to a covenant they once made, and so on? I don't think those people have much of an answer for that question. It might not bother them because they don't believe that people will live as married couples in the next life. And if they don't make and live for the covenants to do that, as for themselves, they're right. But for people who live in the belief, as I do, that marriage relations can be for eternity, then you must say, what will life be in the next life when you're married to more than one wife for eternity? I have to say, I don't know. But I know that I've made those covenants, and I believe if I'm true to those covenants, that the blessing that's anticipated here will be realized in the next life. How? Why, I don't know. Right? This is an apostle. This is trust, right? It's trust that the Lord will never do anything to us or with us that we don't wholeheartedly accept and that isn't calculated to make us deliriously, undescribably happy. If you have concluded something else about him, then you do not understand the first thing about him at all. It's important to both of us that Kristen, his second wife, felt comfortable about being a second wife. She understood the eternal doctrine of relationships. She was becoming part of an existing eternal family unit, and she's always been eager to honor and often says, "I'm so thankful for the influence of a righteous woman who refined Dallin and the children into the husband and family I love today." There is something to be said for that, rather than marrying a guy when he's 20, just get one who's well broke in and already an apostle. That would, that has a certain compelling logic to it, I would say. I've learned from many letters, he says, received since my remarriage, that many who've lost a spouse have questions about the effects of remarriage on family relationships in the eternities to come. There are so many different circumstances involving parents and children, and so little is known about the circumstances of the next life, so that it's not possible to give answers to most questions. Some gospel doctrines are revealed only in part. Often, because we do not have these doctrines in their entirety, we cannot tell how they will apply in our circumstances. What we do know is sufficient for our mortal decisions. We know we have a loving Heavenly Father and a loving Savior, Jesus Christ. We trust, there's that word again, in the divine plan of salvation and its loving author, we know that the agency, power of choice that God has given us is a fundamental eternal principle which he will not violate by forcing any of his children into marriage relationships they do not choose. We trust in God that all of this, including a second marriage in his temple, will, when covenants are honored, result in the greatest possible happiness for all concerned. And Elder Quentin L. Cook said just about 2.5 years ago, in the senior councils of the church, there is a feeling that polygamy, as it was practiced, served its purpose and we should honor those saints. But that purpose has now been accomplished and that it isn't necessary now. There are unanswered questions and we don't always receive revelation on everything. I'd remind you, Jacob 2 says that the Lord, he talks about monogamy, and he says he'll command you if it's going to be otherwise. Otherwise, they'll listen to this thing. Monogamy is the default setting. Polygamy is the exception. Harold B. Lee said this, and this applies to marriage things, to church history things, to things that happen in your lives, all the sort of stuff that happens. There seems to be this conception, and I think if you spell it out specifically, we probably don't, we would say we don't believe it, but a lot of people seem to believe it. And that is somehow that if things aren't, anything that blocks me in this life or at this moment from having exactly what I want or exactly what I think will make me happy is somehow unjust or unfair or, someone is oppressing me. That just isn't the case. You are part of a religion, both the Church of Jesus Christ and Christianity generally, that had a Savior who said, if any man will come after me, let him take up his cross daily and follow me. What's a cross? Well, Jesus knew something about crosses. I don't think that's a symbol he used lightly or flippantly. A cross is a piece of wood to which you are nailed and tortured and disgraced. It was the most disgraceful form of death the Romans knew how to inflict, and probably one of the most painful ones. So Jesus is telling us that if you become his disciple, you may get pain, you may get grief, you may get torture, and you may be shamed before the world. In fact, you can virtually guarantee it. So if you are thinking you're in a faith where that can't or won't or shouldn't happen to you, you have not been paying attention. You did not read the small print. So that's again why I say, if this isn't true, you should find something else. Because it's certainly not worth it if that's the price. Okay? But it is worth it because it is true. Harold B. Lee said this, I want to bear testimony that every one of us of the 12 has had that kind of testing. Some of us have been tried and have been tested until our very heartstrings would seem to break. I have heard of persons dying with a broken heart, and I thought that was just a sort of poetic expression, but I learned that it could be a very real experience. I came near to that thing, but when I began to think of my own troubles, I thought of what the Apostle Paul said of the Master. Though he was a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. If you expect to become like Jesus, how on earth do you expect to do that without experiencing a little bit of what Jesus experienced? And Jesus' life was not easy, ever. Don't be afraid, says Elder Lee, of the testing and trials of life. Sometimes when you're going through the most severe tests, you'll be nearer to God than you have any idea. For like that experience of the Master himself in the temptation on the Mount, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and on the cross at Calvary, the Scriptures record, and behold, angels came and ministered unto him. Sometimes that may happen to you in the midst of your trials. So, like earlier saints, we will have our trials on earth, and I think for the saints in the 19th century, plural marriage was definitely one of those trials. But trials do not continue into the celestial kingdom. They end. It's partly why it's so great. The last thing I'll mention, there's probably more. This is my ancestor, Isaiah Moses Coombs. He went west to the valley because his family was very poor. They were members of the church. They couldn't afford to go east, so he went by himself. He left his wife and newborn child behind because they refused to go with him. And he went to the valley because he knew that was the only way his family could be with the saints. I mean, I owe this man a lot. He talks about when he left home, how he sat on the wagon that was taking him, and he closed his eyes, and he kept them closed until he left, because he knew that if he had opened them and looked back at his wife and his house, he wouldn't have been able to do it. I don't think he knew, or I suspect he did not know how many people were counting on him, but I was one of the people counting on him. He practiced plural marriage at his wife's insistence. So I always think about him when I give this talk. But he tells a story that has really nothing to do with plural marriage that I want to end with, but in some ways it has everything to do with plural marriage. It has everything to do with anything that tries you or bothers you or troubles you about the history of the church or the way the church is now. He was on the plains, and he says this: "One hot afternoon, I was sitting in the tent, suffering from a severe attack of cholera morbus." So that's basically severe diarrhea. You can lose several liters of fluid an hour. It's a good way to die. So he's in a hot tent with diarrhea. Probably not at this is not the high point of his life. While I sat thus, Elder Daniel Spencer came to the tent door, leading a horse by its bridle. "Here, Brother Coombs," said he, "I want you to take this horse and take a ride about 12 miles out on the Little Grasshopper," that's a river, stream, "where Brother Selchrist Company will camp tonight, and borrow some money for Brother Snow." Now, I'm not a real expert in 19th century medicine, but I'm pretty sure sitting on a horse for 12 miles is not the recommended treatment for diarrhea. I answered, says Brother Coombs, that I could not possibly, that I was racked with pain, and I had made up my mind to die that night. "Oh, no," replied Brother Spencer, "you will not die. You will have a pleasant canter over the prairie, and I promise you in the name of the Lord that you will return feeling much better, and that you shall be sick no more till you get home." Well, he says, with that promise, I allowed him to help me into the saddle, and after receiving my instruction, proceeded to slowly and wearily wend my way through the encampment till I reached the highway on the prairie. Here I gave my horse the rein, and just as the sun was sinking beyond the western horizon, I started off on a keen gallop for the distant Grasshopper. The first few jumps of my steed occasioned me great pain, but I hung on to the pommel of the saddle, determined that the ride would either kill me or cure me. I had not gone far before all pain left me. Thereupon a wild, reckless spirit took possession of me, and putting spurs to my horse, I dashed along the road at headlong speed, whooping and yelling as I went. But I continued not in that mood a great while. On reaching a grove of timber, I dismounted, and on my knees I returned thanks to God for this manifestation of his loving kindness to me. I there promised, if he would forgive the lukewarm service I had hitherto rendered him, that I would in future give him my whole heart. I arose feeling that I stood on holy ground, remounted my horse, and pursued my journey. Close quote. So that humbles me. This man who had left everything was at that moment saying, well, I really haven't given you as much as I should have. And I think for many trials in life, including trials about church history or particularly plural marriage, because of how the places it hits us, it's a lot like that. You may feel it's going to kill you. What you're being asked to do, which is to move on and support the leaders of the church and all that, may seem like the most difficult, unreasonable, impossible thing to do. But I can promise you that if you will get on the horse and if you will start riding, it's going to be painful at first, but before you know it, you're going to have grass under your feet and peace in your heart, and you will be back home in the valley. And that will be but a taste of when we all enter the celestial kingdom with those who have trusted in the Lord our God, to go no more out, where God wipes away all tears and makes all things right. That can happen and does happen and will happen for you if you are sincere and you are willing to do whatever he asks you to do. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.